The concept of style in photography can be a difficult one, especially as a new photographer. It's something we often strive for as photographers, to have our own unique look, one that really makes us stand out from the crowd and be recognizable to others. But how important is it really? And how does one even develop a style in photography? Although we all want to obtain a clear style, it's not always as simple as something you either have or you don't have. But what can you do as a photographer if you're looking to build your own style? And how should we go about this? So this is what I've come up with in this video, thinking about these questions a lot. Hopefully some useful tips and conclusions along the way if you're wanting to develop your own photography style. So let's jump in. Firstly, what is style in photography? I think the best way to answer this question is to think about a photographer you can always immediately recognize their work just from a photo alone, without seeing their name or anything else attached to it. The easiest example in today's world would be scrolling on Instagram, see an image and instantly know who it's from before even seeing the username. But what makes an image recognizable to you? That's their style, made up of a real mixture of things. At a basic level, it could start with the type of photography they shoot and the subject matter involved, ultimately what someone chooses to shoot and to be in their photos. Even the lighting conditions, the composition or framings, colors or lack of people use, and the colors people are attracted to when they take photos. Even more into settings and how you choose to process or edit your images, sometimes even down to the gear and the focal length being used. So many different things, some I probably missed, that all mash into one and produce this product that we might define as photography style. Personally, I think my style has developed over time, but it always feels like a work in progress. And maybe it always will feel like that, which is totally fine. I think style is a very fluid thing that often doesn't have a fixed endpoint, constantly changing and evolving. But rather than looking at my own work in this video, I thought I might look at a photographer hopefully many of you will be familiar with. A photographer who I'm drawn to, and one I know a lot of photographers draw inspiration from. This is the great Saul Leiter, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with his photography. If you're not, I highly recommend seeking out more about him after this video and even checking out some of his photo books, like this one here, which I can definitely recommend, and I'll link down below if you do want to check it out. From all reports, he was a very interesting and very humble character, and I think this is the first point I'd like to make on style. Often, style really does reflect one's personality. What you choose to capture and how you choose to capture it can say a lot about you. His subject matter is often quite similar and appears sometimes quite seasonal, with most of the subjects often dressed in heavy clothing and often featuring dramatic weather conditions like snow. This is something you might not consider when talking about style, but when and where you choose to shoot even plays a big part in this. Clear in his style are these muted but consistent colors, often seeing these snippets of red and yellow throughout his work. How he found this beauty that most would pass by without noticing, and how he used color to really complement his compositions. But also the abstractions and the way he chooses to frame a lot of his images, often using different layers of objects and reflections, sometimes almost like a collage, and often only giving us little pieces of a scene, also rarely showing people's faces. I think the way he captured people in his street photography could also say a lot about his personality. Very different from the documentary style of street photography, he captured quite simple everyday objects and people, not really fitting into this more traditional idea of documentary street photography. Even the way he often used longer focal lengths and the way he framed images makes me think he wasn't someone who liked to get up in people's faces, possibly didn't like confrontation, or really drawing a lot of attention to himself on the street. And from the interviews I've watched of him, I think this fits. The way he often shoots through objects like windows and often using reflections probably speaks to this as well. Naturally, these are just my interpretations, but hopefully fair assumptions reflected in his style. Again, open to interpretation. Ultimately, your style ends up being a reflection of you. This is something I've only thought about more recently when looking at my own photography, but also studying others. Looking at my work, I see where I am most comfortable and even see my personality as more of an introvert in my photography. I don't particularly like troubling people and get uncomfortable if people are noticing me out on the street. So although I've tried to lean into that a little bit to push myself outside my comfort zone, I know I won't ever be this documentary style of street photographer wanting to really throw myself into the heart of the action. Despite trying to push against this, it's why I also struggled calling myself a street photographer for such a long time. Which brings me to my next point, fitting yourself into a box. Certainly labels in terms of photography styles have a purpose, but aren't always incredibly useful, especially when you might not fit into other people's clear definitions of photography styles. Saul Leiter is a great example. Not really fitting into a lot of people's definition of traditional street photography. This wasn't even his work at the time, mostly working professionally in fashion, with his street photography only becoming recognized much later on. So I doubt he would ever care whatever label was placed on his style. He obviously just enjoyed doing it and really enjoyed experimenting with it. So sure, these labels can be useful if you fit neatly into one of these boxes, like a landscape portrait or said street photographers, but what if you don't? Should you try to fit yourself neatly into one of these boxes? I don't think you should. Over the years, I've struggled with this, rarely putting a clear label on what I shoot. But ultimately, I don't care anymore. I shoot what I like shooting. This has kept me really interested and enjoying my photography over the long term, which might not have happened if I forced myself to really niche down early on. Actually, most of the photographers who inspire me don't always fit neatly into one of these categories either, but they still have a very clear and unique style despite this. Remember, as useful as some labels are, you don't always need to place yourself or your style neatly into one of these boxes, and you can embrace that. Find a label you're comfortable with. Now, I often say I like capturing simple everyday moments in a mixture of travel and street photography because this fits in better with what I do. To finish off, I wanted to cover my thoughts on how you might find your own style in photography. This is purely advice that worked for me, but sadly, there's no quick solution here. Ultimately, style isn't something you stumble across one day. It comes through consideration and practice. This was summed up well in another video I watched recently while researching this idea that really stuck with me. And that's, you don't ultimately find a style, it finds you, which I loved because it seemed true for me. But are there things you can do to develop it faster? I think so. Things like following what interests you, experimenting with different types of photography within that. See what you really enjoy capturing. See where this takes you. This is experimenting with subject matter, different composition. These will all help develop your style. Find photographers who inspire you within those interests, not copying, but really studying them deeply. Study what draws you into their work. What do you like about it? What conditions are they shooting in? What subjects do they shoot? How can you implement some of these things into your own practice? Ultimately, the more you practice these things, the more you will evolve and the more your style will develop. Seeing what works for you and what you enjoy shooting. Remember, there's no end point here for any of us. We are all always learning, always evolving, and hopefully always improving in some way. From here, with lots of practice, you will refine those interests further and further until a very clear style emerges. If you're anything like me, it might start to emerge without you even realizing. So don't force things, keep practicing, keep studying the art of photography. Ultimately, your style will find you. I hope you have enjoyed this one. It's one I've really enjoyed thinking and talking about. Please do subscribe if you did, and remember, keep on creating, keep on growing, my friends. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.